Welcome back to Foresight Paradigm. This is Paradigmatic Conversations or Discussions number 3. I'm speaking with author David Fitzgerald. How are you?
Hey, good, thanks.
Awesome. And we also have Scott Gaines back. Hey, Scott, how you doing?
I'm great. Thanks
All
for
right,
having
so we're going to be going over Mr. Fitzgerald's book, Nailed. If you can see it. Uh, how are you?
Just went to the
These,
phantom
yeah,
zone.
a little bit there. So this book is about, it's called the 10 Christian Myths that, there you go. There you go. The 10 Christian myths that show Jesus never existed at all. So we're going to be kind of going through these point by point. Um, just to start off, Mr. Fitzgerald,
You can call
my
me Dave.
question, okay, Dave, works for me. Um, so the consensus and majority of biblical scholars pretty much agree about the following things, I believe. So they believe that, or they acknowledge that Moses and the patriarchs likely didn't exist.
Right.
Okay. That the Exodus and other stories did not happen, or at least not happen in any scale close to what the Bible reports. Um, they acknowledge that many books have been spliced together with multiple authors,
Right. You know
often
what?
by anonymous authors.
And yeah, all these things so far are true. And I should clarify that these are true among secular scholars. If you look at biblical studies as a whole, it's a whole different thing because there's a whole
Okay.
huge segment of the scholarly world in biblical studies that believes all that's true, all the way down
Okay.
to Adam and Eve and the talking snake.
Well, I've heard that it's the consensus. So is there like a
We just have to be
segregated?
well, we have to be careful how we use that word consensus. If you
Okay.
say the consensus among secular scholars or even objective scholars,
Right.
yeah, all those things
Which
are
do
accepted.
include a lot of Christians, I assume.
Say again.
Which does include a lot of Christians, I assume.
Not on the secular side. This is the
Uh,
thing.
okay.
You've got whenever you're talking about the scholarly consensus on anything really, but especially for biblical studies, there's a line of division right down the middle, right from the get-go, and that's something we always have to keep in mind. Um, when I wrote the follow-up book to Nailed, that was one of the things I pointed out was the problem with the consensus in the case of Jesus is that there is no consensus among secular scholars on who he was or what he did, or even did he exist or not.
Okay.
Um, yeah. So anyway,
Okay.
as soon as you start saying any of this about biblical studies, you start going down rabbit holes. So I'm trying to
Right.
hold off as many as we can.
Okay. Well, also the consensus is, I guess, among secular scholars that there are many forgeries and alterations.
Yeah.
Um, they were written very late, and the Gospels were written long after the supposed time of Jesus. Jesus was not a superhero, nor did he, perform miracles. Um, there are different views in the Bible of Jesus, like his character and the salvation, how to obtain salvation.
Right.
Um, I think some even admit the influence of like Sumerian myth, like Gilgamesh, and the mystery cults with the prior
Definitely the
resurrected
mystery cult
gods. Yeah.
for sure. For sure.
Um, so, and there were also many apocalyptic, like rabbi miracle workers around that time in that area.
Right.
And so I'm listing all of this to kind of get down to the end point here is that despite all this, that they acknowledge all of this, why do the majority of them accept that Jesus existed as a man?
Right.
Even I guess the secular scholar. So what is
Right. And
the
that's a
main reason?
great question. Um, and long story short, to answer that question, I wound up writing 3 more books after I wrote Nail, talking about that. And
Gotcha.
but if I was going to break it down, um, first of all, one of the things I pointed out was when you talk about biblical scholars as a whole, not only are most of them Christian, but they work for Christian institutions and they are contractually obligated to toe the line in theology on every level, not just about the historicity of Jesus, but on the inerrancy of the Bible, for instance, on the patriarchs, on things
Right.
that other historians know full well didn't really happen, like the Exodus, like the Garden of Eden, like the conquest of the Promised Land.
Right.
Most scholars totally agree these didn't happen. When we talk about Jesus, the interesting thing about that is if you get 50 secular biblical scholars, Jesus scholars in there, they'll be talking about 50 separate Jesuses for the most part. That's an exaggeration, but really the fact is we've gone on these things called the historical quests for Jesus, and there's been 3 of them since 1900 with Albert Schweitzer. And at the end of every single one of them, we've thrown up our hands and said, oh, wait, all these tools we've been using, these so-called criteria of authenticity, these don't work. And Richard Carey has done a great job of collecting the reasons for that in his book, Proving History, which has relevance for any kind of historical question, but especially relevant with the tools that people have used for Jesus studies. They just don't work. And even Christians have admitted that. There's a great book called something along the lines of Jesus Criteria and Authenticity, and the Demise of Authenticity. I'm getting the title not quite right, but where biblical scholars in the 80s are talking about biblical scholars in the 40s recognizing the problems that we have with Jesus in particular. It's a very weird situation with Jesus.
So you would say it's basically because they're biased.
Well, there is a bias, and we can't deny that there is a bias, but with secular scholars, there's not a bias.
So what is the key?
But they're still using the same tools, and they're relying on information that seems to have been ironclad and well established. And for instance, Bart Ehrman, his book "Did Jesus Exist?" His succeeding books, you can tell that he's realizing that things he was taking as ironclad, well established facts are not so much so. And I had to read I read the first 100 pages of his following book before I disagreed with anything he was saying at all.
Oh yeah, he's great. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, speaking of Bart Ehrman, he's probably my favorite biblical scholar out there. And I've been telling people for years that for such a strong historicist who's sure there was a Jesus, he's one of the best mythicist writers out there because he's done so much to expose the bias in biblical studies, the forgery in early Christianity, all those things you were talking about at the beginning of the show. He's done an amazing job at showing how these are not to be relied on. Whether there was a Jesus or not, our historical evidence for him is not great.
His book, Jesus Interrupted, I think is really, really good. It's kind of like the definitive, biblical study where it's at and all the issues that it's uncovered.
Yeah.
I think the main thing that he talks about is James. Jesus has had a brother named James, and why would Paul talk about his brother James?
Right. Well, and the funny thing about that is when you see, and for what it's worth, I think that connection is probably one of the best arguments historicists can make. And I wish he had done more of that in his book, Did Jesus Exist? Because
I haven't read that book, but yeah.
Well, here's the thing. We were super disappointed with it. Not because we expected him to agree with us, but we thought it was going to be the best arguments for historicity and clear all the deadwood of all the crappy mythicist theories out there. Like it was all invented by Josephus, or it was Roman social control, or any number of other crazy ass things.
Yeah, I did read a book called The Jesus Mysteries by Timothy Freak, or I can't remember the name. And it was fascinating, but then I learned subsequently that maybe a lot of it's kind of not up to par.
I had the same exact experience with that book. Yeah. Both their books, actually. Yeah.
But at least some of the material there is pretty valid, right? But you kind of have to know how to.
When you have to do your research and fact check which is, it's like what's the use of the book if you have to start all over again and doing it. Yeah.
David, something. Let me jump in and add something really quick. I noticed we're talking a lot about how these people come to these conclusions and these beliefs, and the logic most certainly ends up being circular. And do you ever find it really funny that, for instance, Mormons can say, hey, here's our first copy of this book, and that proves it, but no one would say, here's my first editions of L. Ron Hubbard and say this proves Scientology.
Right. And the funny thing about that is for the first 100, 150, maybe 200 years of Christianity, we don't even have that. We have nothing. So we don't even know if our Gospels, if our Acts, if our epistles, how much they related to the originals at all.
Isn't the earliest manuscript like a little piece of John called, like, I forget the number, but like from 200 years after.
P52.
It's like a little bitty fragment.
It's smaller than a credit card. The whole thing was shown.
Yeah.
But here's the funny thing about that. I mentioned that in Nailed, that this thing, because it's been dated to about early mid first century, from like 125 to 175. And so when you hear Christians talk about that, what do they say? Oh, here's the earliest gospel. It dates to 125. And it's like, well, no, dudes, that's the earliest date it could possibly be. But the funny thing about that is that subsequently we've discovered that the actual archaeologists and papyrologists who discovered this, oh no, we never said it was that old. This thing is late 2nd century or early 3rd century. It's 100 years older than that, which means not only is that not the earliest New Testament gospel fragment, but it means our earliest gospel fragment is from one of those other gospels that didn't make the cut. It's not even Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. So the layers of irony just continue to dogpile on each other.
Right. Well, we're going to get into your book kind of chapter by chapter, the 10 myths. But before we get into the details, what is your best summary, briefly, of the case against historicity for mythicism?
You're asking someone who's written 4 books to distill it down into one.
If you can, just the best you can. Yeah.
I mean, I said at the end of Nailed that there was one paradox that really struck out at me. And again, this is speaking as a guy who 20 years ago, it never even crossed my mind that there might not be a Jesus. Like, of course there was a Jesus. So why would you doubt that? And when I started to pick into the Gospels to try to pick out what was the real Jesus and what was the legendary, can we say bullshit on this show?
Yeah.
The legendary accretion that came afterwards. One of the first things that stood out at me is that you've got this guy who was, according to these Gospels, was wildly famous and taught these amazing revolutionary things, and no one outside his cult notices for 100 years or more. Right. So either he said these things and no one noticed, or he didn't do these things, and he was just one more apocalyptic loser Messiah at the time. And yet, as soon as he's dead, you've got all these little house cults, not just in the Galilee, not just in Jerusalem, but all over the Roman Empire, to Alexandria, to Corinth, to Rome itself. And these little house cults can't agree about the first thing about Jesus. And the further we go back, when you get to the book of Hebrews, when you look at what Paul says for the most part, he's talking about a Jesus that he's seen in visions and in his scriptural studies. That one verse where he talks about, I didn't see any apostles, I only saw James, the brother of the Lord. He didn't say Jesus is a brother. And the very next chapter, he's talking about all these guys that we think of as Jesus' friends and family. And he's saying, yeah, I don't even think these guys are real Christians. I didn't, he opposes them constantly, and he treats them like they're big face, and he's the only one that's got the real Christianity going.
And what's really crazy is that if you look at how good of a history the Romans kept, like, where is the census set that he's supposedly in? Where's his execution, list with his name on it? Where's all these things that, like you said in a speech of yours I listened to, you said, he's out here making a lot of noise and people didn't write about him until centuries later. Yeah. I mean, like most people live to 50 years old. Well, so this is several, maybe 40. So we're talking about multiple lifetimes later when they just start writing about it, which is crazy.
I think first century Jewish males only lived for an average of 27 years, actually. Yeah.
Wow.
And here's the thing I want to break that down a little bit more because you're making a really good point. A lot of atheists or early mythicists try to say, look, he's not in any of this Roman stuff. And critics of that rightly pointed out, well, we wouldn't expect him to show up on that. And it's like, yeah, you're right. Except for here. And I can't remember if it's in Nailed or if it's in Jesus Mything in Action, but I actually break down, for instance, all these other wannabe messiahs and these loser apocalyptic prophets who don't do anything anywhere near as fascinating as what Jesus did, and yet all of them managed to make a dent in the historical record that Jesus didn't. That was a red flag for me.
Right. And I believe that the scholars that were mythicists kind of started showing up in the Victorian era, right? More or less.
Well, I mean, it's depending on where you count it, because there were like 2nd century and 3rd century critics of Christianity saying,
Celsus,
this Galilee story doesn't work yet. There's no Galilee.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Pointing out
But
all
their
the-
arguments have never been refuted. They've just been kind of pushed aside, more or
I
less.
think I'd say they've been harumphed, quoting Robert Price.
Yeah.
It's funny. There's an ancient. I'm trying to think if it was Justin Martyr or if it was Tatian. I'm forgetting the actual church father who wrote a book where he's having an imaginary argument with Jews of his time, and so he's kind of presenting all the arguments he's getting thrown at. And
Right.
one of them says, "Yeah, if there's a Jesus, no one's ever heard of him, and you Christians have invented him for yourself, and for his imaginary God, you're needlessly
Right.
suffering." Yeah.
Well, Justin Martyr, he talks about he writes pretty clearly that the parallels between the pagan, like, resurrected gods, and he even says, like, you think that the sons of Jupiter, that something special, the things that they do, but
We're
we
not
say the
saying
same thing
anything
about
different.
Jesus. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
and
And
I believe he
of
wrote
that-
around 150 CE, something like that, right?
A couple
Not
centuries.
very-
Yeah.
Yeah.
But another funny thing about that is, in response to that, there were Christians like Firmicus Maternus who came up with this idea that, oh, well, obviously the devil saw in the prophecies that he saw what Christianity was going to look like, and so he made all these counterfeit copies in advance.
Yeah.
Checkmate, atheists. Yeah.
Sorry,
He made all those. He made all those counterfeit fossils too, and put them in the correct layer every time as well.
Very good at what he's saying. Yeah. That's
So
going
through your chapter list here, you have myth number 1, the idea that Jesus was a myth is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Number 2, Jesus was wildly famous, but number 3, ancient historian Josephus wrote about Jesus. Myth number 4, eyewitnesses wrote the Gospels. Myth number 5, the Gospels give a consistent picture of Jesus. Number 6, history confirms the Gospels. Number 7, archaeology confirms the Gospels. Number 8, Paul and the epistles corroborate the Gospels. Number 9, Christianity began with Jesus and his apostles. And number 10, Christianity was totally new and different.
Yeah. And let me just say, all those are myths, whether there was a real Jesus or not, at the end of the day. Whether there was or not, you can't use those arguments for him because none of them hold up under close observation.
So tell me, Mr. Fitzgerald, David, how does Jesus stack up with Caesar and Alexander the Great, and even Shakespeare? Because I had someone tell me once, we have more evidence for Jesus than Shakespeare.
Someone's told me the same on Socrates too.
Yeah,
someone said this about Socrates.
Yeah, you can use a fill in the blank for just about every single ancient person. Usually they max out on the ancient world, but yes, Shakespeare, Lincoln, I've heard that too. People we actually have photographs of. They're like, oh,
wow,
we got pictures for Jesus. It's like, wow.
Yeah. Wow.
I mean, we'd have to go case by case, but in almost every single one of those, in every single one of those cases, we have multiple lines of evidence supporting the existence of this person or that person. And even the ones they try to say, oh no, this was happening hundreds of years later. No, usually it's not. That the Christian apologetic attempts I've seen to defeat that usually boomerang on them. And in fact, the one kind of evidence that we have for Jesus is not the best kind, but the absolutely worst kind. We have these 4 biographies, 4 out of many others that were written, not by eyewitnesses, though they're all falsely claimed to be eyewitnesses. They don't agree with each other. They're all obviously written to convince people to believe in a religion. And the synoptic gospels, the first 3 gospels, are clearly all based off the first one because they've cut and paste and then they've blown up on it. So they're either in lockstep with it or they're going off in completely incompatible directions.
Right. This is a quote from Carrier about Alexander the Great, for one example.
Yeah.
So he says, we have details about him in several contemporary or eyewitness sources still extant, including the speeches of Isocrates and Demosthenes, I don't know if I'm getting these names right, and Aeschines and Hyperides and Dinarchus. Man, I've studied ancient Greece quite a lot. I don't know how to pronounce these names. All right. The poetry of Theocritus, the scientific works of Theophrastus, and the plays of Neander. We have not a single contemporary mention of Jesus apart from at best the letters of Paul, who never even knew him and says next to nothing about him.
Yeah. And what's more to that is Richard Carrier also points out that we have different kinds of evidence for all those people. We have physical evidence. We have some of them. We have the
Coins for Alexander the Great, right?
Exactly,
Pretty
and we have
close
the sheer. I forget the term he used for it, but the fact that it could only happen. We would only have this if Hannibal really had crossed into Rome, and not just a legend had built up about him.
Right.
But for all these different kinds, we have nothing for Jesus in all but one of those categories.
Right. You point out that the first century is actually considered one of the best documented periods in ancient history, and Judea, far from being a forgotten backwater, was a turbulent province of vital strategic importance to the Romans. There were plenty of writers, both Roman and Jewish, who had great interest in and much to say about the region and its happenings during Jesus' time. So, it really doesn't work that nobody would have noticed, especially if he was doing the miraculous things that, the Gospels claim.
For sure. And there's some people try to say, well, we know he wasn't the Son of God, but there really was a dude. But again, and there's nothing implausible about that. I mean, there were dime a dozen at the time. But it's just our evidence doesn't point to that. It points to this just being a story that became later historicized.
And you point out that we don't have any, extra biblical or non-gospel, evidence for like a century later.
And when it first starts showing up, it's letters from a provincial governor to basically the equivalent of the Attorney General of the Roman Empire, and he's saying, "I heard of these dudes before. I'm not even sure what we do with them." And it's like they were socially invisible 100 years after, and it wasn't until like 200 or 300 years after the fact that they went from just being completely, not even Jehovah's Witness level tiny, but just some minor cultling on the periphery of Roman society.
Right. You point out there's some events in the Gospels that should have made history, but they didn't, such as Caesar taxes the world, Herod's slaughter of the innocents, Jesus' famous ministry, his triumphant entry into Jerusalem, the trial of Jesus, his crucifixion, his miracles, and there's not really any, they didn't really make history. And nobody,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Couldn't say it better. I mean, that's what more can you say? Yeah.
Yeah. You point out in Matthew alone, you have these, extravagant, things that happen, like the earthquakes and the mass, resurrection of many of the dead saints, and only Matthew seems to know about these. Like, how is that?
And I've had Christians come to me and accuse me of creating a straw man just by quoting what those two verses in Matthew are saying. It's like, he says they came out and they wandered to Jerusalem appearing to many. And it's like, dude, you tell me how that gets missed.
Now, here's my question.
In the meantime, we hear boring gossip about, the temple being, built and who funded it and stuff. Zombocalypse in Jerusalem never made the cut. Yeah. What are you going to say, Scott?
My question on that is like twofold. Is like, if so many people were being resurrected, does that make Jesus a little less special? And some of these people had been dead for quite a while. Were they like Skeletor, or did their flesh come back, or how did this work?
These are all such good questions, and no matter how you slice them, it's like somebody should have noticed it. Oh, Elijah! Hey, Moses, how's it going?
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah. Any one of those alone would have made world history. Yeah, for sure.
Now you point out about the there's like a few there's a real paucity of extra biblical mention of Jesus, but you do mention some of them, like Josephus and I think Tacitus and a couple others. And you talk about how they're really way after the time, and they're also often not discussing Christ; they're discussing Christians, and they're just kind of repeating what Christians already were saying.
Exactly. And another further irony to that is most of the ones that are telling stories about Christian martyrdoms, it has been since turned out that those are stolen from Jewish martyrdom stories in many cases. In fact, the myth of persecution by I'm blanking on her name, but it's an amazing book, and she is a devout Christian who's gone into the history of the people debunking these persecution myths. Let's go back a little bit to Josephus, because He's the one name that keeps popping up when people talk about history, historical evidence for Jesus. And the reason is, even though he supposedly was born, after Jesus died and wrote at the end of the first century, he's the closest thing to a eyewitness that we have. Even though he's not an eyewitness, even though
he was a Jewish Roman.
He was a Jewish Roman writer. And I'll just dispense with him really quickly because I spend chapters and chapters talking about why this is not true. But there's two passages. One's not even talking about our Jesus at all, full stop, and you just have to read it to realize that. And it's not even that remarkable or that much of a stretch to argue and make. But what's called the Testimonium Flavinium is supposedly this little paragraph in the middle of his history about something else happening in Jerusalem, where he suddenly breaks into this commercial for Jesus, basically, and starts talking about, and again, at this time, there was this wonderful dude named Jesus, and he was amazing, blah, blah, blah. Things that a first century Orthodox Jew would never say about anybody, let alone the guy that his own party crucified and executed. And I'll just say, no one thinks that this passage is not a forgery. But what they've shifted the goalpost to say is, well, it's only a partial forgery, that he did mention Jesus, and Christians, tarted it up later. But the problem with that is, for half a millennia, for 500 years, there's only one Christian who even seems to know about this passage, and that's Eusebius, the same guy who gave us any number of other forgeries that we're familiar with.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about him, too. He was kind of like Constantine's, what was he?
Constantine's biographer, basically. He wrote like 5 or 6 different versions of Constantine to keep up with the realities.
Talk about how he was a liar, or he was kind of a known liar, and he said he was a liar. I think he was lied to the faith. Yeah.
Well, that's disputed because that's a title in his writings that was probably inserted by somebody else. He probably didn't write that using lies for the benefit of Christianity. But he certainly believed that, because when Constantine was alive, he would blame his victories. He would give thanks to his victories to Apollo, and he was a lifelong pagan, and that's what was responsible for his victories. After Constantine was dead, all of a sudden we get this story that, oh no, it's because he saw the Cairo, not even the cross, but the Greek symbol for the Cairo in the sky, which incidentally had both pagan meanings and Christian meanings. So it was another case of him playing both sides against each other. Don't get me started on him. Anyway.
I think it's so obvious that, you get to the Roman emperors of the 4th century, you get to Constantine, and you get to Theodosius. And that's obviously how Christianity spread. I mean, before that, I think it grew so slowly, it grew a little bit, but you don't even get like any mention of it like in the 3rd century
for sure
at all.
Yeah.
And I think I've heard different estimations, like it was 10% of the empire or 5% of the empire in its first 300 years before it got, power.
Right. And it really didn't start growing at all until the Roman Empire started going to hell in the 3rd century. As long as the Roman Empire was doing fine, Mithras, all these other gods, all these other pantheons were doing just fine.
Yeah.
But as soon as things started going, to hell in a handbasket, all of a sudden this little doomsday cult was.
And Constantine, didn't he make Jesus' birthday, the December 25th, to kind of match up with the Sol Invictus, winter equinox, or what's it called, the winter
solstice?
Yeah, the solstice.
Yeah. You're right about that connection. I don't remember if it was Constantine or Theodosius who did that.
Okay.
But yeah, absolutely. It just
There's
so happened. What's that?
I was going to mention, because you mentioned Mithras, there's a great new sci-fi show on HBO Max called Raised by Wolves. And it's actually about, there's a group of, Earth is basically destroyed by a war between believers and atheists. The atheists send a ship of androids to raise, the humans as atheists on this other planet. And the religion of the believers, I think, is Mithras. It's Sol. They keep saying Sol be with us. And
Sol Invictus.
yeah. It's
Unconquered Sun.
Yeah.
That sounds awesome. I have to check that out.
Oh yeah, it's really good. Yeah.
I had a completely different impression of it from the trailer, but yeah, that sounds awesome.
It is. It's just
something I'd like to ask before we get into the chapter breakdown is
we're already there, and we're kind of going through it already.
Well, yeah, but I'm saying before we get going to structurally is what do you think about the concept of hell and it being added in later on, because it doesn't show up until Jesus gets here? I kind of like if you could give us a quick view of, do you think that is an extra addition, maybe by one of the committees, the Council of Nicaea or some other thing? Like, how do you think that got snuck in there?
That's a great question. I only really know the setup, and that's that in the ancient world, the Jews, like most people, just thought there was a waiting room at the end, Sheol, where everybody goes, good, bad, boom. They all go there. It's kind of boring. They just basically...
Sometimes they thought there was nothing, like in Ecclesiastes.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. Ecclesiastes, how did that get into the Bible at all? I wonder. That's one of the books.
Or the Song of Solomon, or
Song
the one that's like really erotic.
Don't give me started. Have you seen my Sex and Violence in the Bible talk on YouTube?
I haven't.
No, I need to check that out, though.
You need to check it out. And that's the book I'm working on right now. It's Sex and Violence in the Bible. And
cool.
Yeah. You'll dig it. It's pretty cool. But so basically there was no hell until after the Babylonian captivity, where they took the Zoroastrian idea of, there's a good place and a bad place, and Ramazda runs the good place, and Ahriman, the adversary, runs the bad place, and that's where bad people go. And somewhere between the Babylonian captivity and the Hellenistic period, that became the main idea, and certainly Christianity ran with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And since they, clearly the Jewish people thought they were the chosen ones, they of course had to be right, and this was a test or something. I know when they got captured, they really struggled with even their own faith, wondering, why did we get destroyed so thoroughly if we are the chosen people?
And so much of the Old Testament is retroactively saying, that was God punishing us for being bad. You were bad,
Isn't one of the ways that they know that they knew that the Bible, or like Genesis, was written like really later on, like after the Babylonian exile or during it? It's because like they talk about like animals like camels, I think, that were running around, and like we know there weren't camels in that time, that they want to say that they were written in.
Exactly. Yep. There's lots of anachronisms like that. The Bible Unearthed by Israel Finkelstein and R.A. Simpson. Excellent book, and it does a lot about that. But as I've been writing the Sex and Violence book, one of the things I want to do is talk about that propensity that the Old Testament writers had to blame every bad thing that happened to Israel on the people and on their kings. And and that's where most of the most messed up things in the Bible come from. And they do, but what blew my whole... This is just in May. This hasn't even been 4 months since this really blew me out of the water. Russell Grimerican is a scholar who points out that so much of what we get in the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, the supposed books of Moses, is clearly coming from this Egyptian book over here and this Babylonian book over here, which was written around the same time that the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Bible, was written in Alexandria in 270. Well, he's arguing that that's not just when the translation was done, that's when our Bible was written. That's when it finally came together, the oldest parts and the newest parts. And that just blows my mind. And it's one of those things that you think you have a good handle on the structure of something, like how the Old Testament was written. But there's this one thing in the corner that's been bugging you. And for me, it was this thing called the Elephantine Papyri. And that is this collection of letters from this Jewish mercenary colony in southern Egypt. And we have a century's worth of letters from these folks. And in those, they have a temple, but they worship other gods with the temple, besides Yahweh, or however they...
I mean, this was a Bible, the Old Testament mentioned like Yahweh's wife. I can't remember her name.
Well, the Bible is dripping with all these gods. Like, there's the story where David goes into his tent and pulls out a house idol and dresses it up, and this guy, it's like, well, what was he doing with a house idol in his
and Genesis talks about, I can't remember the phrasing, but like, we are going to make you as us, or as, what is it?
You talking about...
just tell like the polytheistic origins of it.
Yeah, and they say, oh, that's the royal we. It's like, well, no, that's not the royal we, because it's not how they talked back then.
And I've seen how in Genesis they have the A author, the J author, the P author, and they kind of see how it's been spliced together. Yeah, and the authors have like different writing styles, and they call God by different names.
Yep. Exactly.
So it's really fascinating.
And I hope to really dig into that in the new book, because it's fascinating to see, oh, that's why this guy says this and this guy says that. That's why in this verse, so-and-so is a good guy, and in this book, he's a bad guy. That's why Satan does something here and God does something there, the same thing.
And of course, Genesis 1 and 2, they tell completely different creation accounts. And they're completely out of whack with science, the order.
Yeah.
Well, think how hard it is even to fact check and, compare things in a book now with computers. Go back then, these people didn't even know where the sun went at night. So how could they possibly cross-reference and check all this? And that's why I think, as you've talked about before, all of us have, of how people constantly gibber and jabber. Oh, the prophecies are linking up. Well, if you have the old stuff and you're writing the new stuff, you should make it line up. And then you realize that a lot of that doesn't even line up.
Exactly.
So this is just nonsense. It's crazy.
Often it's the mistakes they make that we can tell. Like, for instance, that's how we know that Luke was stealing from Josephus and not Josephus stealing from Luke. It's because he makes mistakes, and it's in better context. It's more complete. Blah 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 blah. It's where you'd expect it to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One thing that I really find interesting that you talk about is how the different Jesuses and different Gospels are like different characters.
Yeah.
So Mark's Jesus uses traditional pagan magic techniques like spit and magic words.
And mud.
Yeah. And mud, yeah.
And it doesn't always work. Sometimes he has to do it a couple times to get it right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Luke's Jesus is like more serene and beatific and unflappable.
Yeah.
So you say, in contrast to the distraught anguish of Mark's Jesus and Matthew's copycat Jesus, Luke's Jesus is as imperturbable as a Japanese geisha and Miss Enemy.
Is that what I said? That's
awesome. Man.
Yeah. And then, of course, John's Jesus is Superman without a Clark Kent.
Yep.
He just called himself God and, the everything. Yeah.
And as I say in the book, was there a shortage of rocks? How did he not get stoned to death right out of the gate?
Right.
Which one killed the tree for not having what he wanted on it at the time?
I think that starts in Matthew. But, the cursing the fig. And it's one of those things that somebody was just talking to me about that, about how they took that as, well, here's a story of him kind of being a dick, losing his temper. Well, that's probably a real story. And then realizing, oh, wait, it's an allegory for this or that. And it's like every weird thing that Jesus does from A to Z in this is a weird allegory for something.
That's why, weirdly enough, someone I had never thought I would really give credit to, but after reading Mere Christianity, I have to give C.S. Lewis some credit, because he said either this is all true and he's the Son of God, or this guy is a madman. I mean, he really is a mad guy.
I don't think that's true, though, Scott. I think there's other alternatives that he misses.
Well, yeah.
Like, none of it could be true.
Exactly.
Liar, lunatic.
But I'm saying
it could be honestly mistaken.
For a Christian to say that, though, was kind of brave, though, I thought,
Yeah. Well, but he meant it in the all or nothing, and he didn't think it out. I think Landon's right about that. It's like, there's also a possibility that
there are more options.
There's more options than that. Your false dichotomy.
You're right about why don't we know when Jesus died? Because we know, like, Cleopatra, when she died.
Yeah.
We know when Mount Vesuvius erupted and destroyed Pompeii.
We even know what time of day it was, Yeah. But we don't have a date for anything in the Gospels.
Yeah.
Not that they agree with each other. John has him dying on a completely different day, and by logic, it's a completely different year because he's messed with his calendar.
So you say about the Gospels, we have 4 contradictory, convoluted, and reworked writings set down decades after the supposed events by unknown authors, falsely being passed off as eyewitnesses, and all primarily derived from a single source, which, as we'll see, appears to be entirely literary fiction, which is Mark, I guess.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. That's it in a nutshell right there. Yeah.
Yeah, so not very reliable sources there.
Yeah.
You talk about Paul.
I just want to bring up Bart Ehrman again. He's done such an amazing job of talking about forgery in Christianity, and he's got 2 really amazing books talking about how one of the hallmarks of Christianity, what things that made it really stand out, is how much forgery is involved in its scriptures.
Right.
And even just it's day-to-day communications, letters from one saint to another. They tampered with everything to make it fit this faction or that faction's.
How close are we to getting to the archaeology part, Landon? Because I have a good question I want to ask there.
That's the next chapter, actually.
Okay, I thought we were getting close. Okay, all right.
So you say, David, that Paul's Jesus is basically his invisible friend, the talking light in the sky. And he never says he gets anything except for Scripture, which is the Old Testament, or visions that he's had.
Oh, you blanked out for a second there, Landon.
Oh, so Paul never met Jesus. Paul never met Jesus. He never claims to have met Jesus, and he gets all his info from the Old Testament, the Scriptures, or revelations in his own head.
Exactly. Revelations and Scripture. And he's constantly telling us, oh, we know this happened according to the Scriptures. He died and rose 3 days later according to the Scriptures. Blah, 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 blah.
Circle.
So getting on to the archaeology chapter, you say the setting of the Gospels is an idealized Never Never Land version of Galilee.
Yeah.
Because the evangelists are trying to appease Roman readers. The gospel portrayed Judea and the Galilee as a peaceful, idyllic countryside under benign Roman rule instead of what they really were, areas of bitter unrest and contrast and constant rebellion against the crushing oppression of Roman soldiers and tax collectors.
Yeah.
You talk about there's like literary giveaways like the ships of the desert, like you say, as Dennis MacDonald has demonstrated, is one of the many indications that Greek epics like Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey inspired Mark. Yeah. Where do you have maritime adventures in landlocked Galilee? That's a good question.
Yeah. And yes, they made tons of them in the Sea of Galilee, which you can cross by a canoe in like under an hour or two, according to critics who are pointing these problems out in the 2nd or 3rd century. Yeah.
Right. Another example, which I really thought was just fascinating, and I've heard Carrier talk about it too. Another gospel locale that seems to be picked for literary allegory is when Luke tells us that the risen Jesus appears to 2 of his followers traveling on the road to Emmaus, a village near Jerusalem, in Luke 24:13. But the entire incident appears to be taken from the ancient Roman legend of Romulus, who, among many other parallels, also appeared alive again after his death to his follower, also traveling along a road in a radiant new form before he returned to heaven. So this seems like an obvious kind of like borrowing of the Romulus tale. They're on the road, he appears. There's so many like similarities.
And it's so funny to hear Christians deny that. Well, they're not exactly alike, so therefore there's no borrowing whatsoever. It's like, have you read the Book of Mormon? You know that was borrowed, right? Yeah.
Now, you say here, at the risk of being redundant, we should remember that there has never been a trace of physical archaeological evidence for Jesus, despite centuries of the never-ending stream of infamous hoaxes such as the Shroud of Turin. And Scott, you wanted to add something about the
I was wondering, it's sort of with the archaeology and something I just found out recently. So I noticed it's Jesus of Nazareth, but he's born in Bethlehem. How did they get to that convoluted point? And here's where I really think a lot of this came from. In ancient Jewish temples, have you seen where it's been found? They had these like huge boilers they hung in the ceiling and smoked, and it was THC has been found in this. And they think that they were literally hallucinating and just seeing all kinds of things. So maybe the burning bush was, as we've joked for a long time, a whole bunch of weed.
You know what?
Who knows?
That's I haven't gone down yet, but it seems in hindsight it seems so obvious, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now you point out, as Bart Ehrman puts it, there are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament.
Right.
So
literally, we have no single pair of manuscripts that match up completely. And it's, again, I want to point out, we're not just talking about typos. We're not just talking about grammatical errors that ascribe. We're talking about they changed it deliberately to say something else. Those are the changes we're concerned about.
How many different committees have there been, like these councils and the thing about that is like, where were they at in the world? What was the dominant language at the time? All the mistranslations of copies of copies of copies. How can anyone justifiably say this is something to rely on, or this is what a all-knowing God would choose to operate in.
Exactly.
And all-knowing God would know that a writing by its nature is going to be left to human interpretation and over time, alterations. But I think the Gospels, they were written in Greek by pretty well-educated people outside of the Judean area, like in, I think, Alexandria and some other places.
We really don't know where they were written, but clearly there were people who were well-versed in Homer and well-versed, Matthew instantly was well-versed in Jewish.
People who would know about these ancient Greek dying and rising gods and others, around the Mediterranean, like Anana and some others.
Yeah, and even Jewish philosophers like Philo, who weren't Christians, and yet so many what he was saying became part of Christian doctrine, like the Holy Spirit.
He's another like silent, potential witness, I think, to Jesus who never mentions him. So
there you go.
So we have no New Testament manuscripts from the first century, let alone the originals. Right. The majority of Bible scholars are convinced that half the letters of Paul, as well as epistles of James, Peter, John, and Jude, are all forgeries.
Let me add something to that. There are a number of scholars who say that all the letters of Paul are completely fake. And
I hadn't heard that. Yeah.
Later, and certainly, at best, every single letter we have attributed to Paul, even the 6 that we think are genuine, even those genuine letters of Paul have been reworked, patched. Maybe they're a patchwork of several different letters. None of these are just straight from the horse's mouth. And
that
also
fragment.
Wait, sorry, I keep jumping in, but there's so many weird things. Every time we talk about anything in the Bible, and there's this and this and this. For instance, how weird is it that of all the first 100 years, we get writings of basically one dude, Paul, and it's like, where was everybody else? Where's all the church history? And
many of which are forgeries, or possibly all.
And when you compare everything that Luke says about in Acts about Paul with what Paul says about Paul, it's like they never line up. It's like, no, I didn't do that. Nope, I did this over here, over there. Yeah.
Right. And Jesus is kind of like absent from Acts. He never appears to do anything to show, give testimony or.
Well, he does one thing. He sticks around for 40 days and convinces them by many convincing proofs that he really came back from the dead. It's like, dude, why did you even need to say that?
And the P52, that's what it's called, the P52 manuscript of John only goes back to some uncertain point in the mid-2nd century, circa 150 CE. And now again, you can kind of see, I don't know if you can see this or not, but a little, stupid.
Here,
kind of see it. It's page 115.
Yeah, I got it. Here it is. So again, both sides of it fits on a credit card very nicely.
That's ridiculous.
About 18 words from the Gospel of John. The only complete word is the word kai, which means and yet, but we know where it's from. The thing of it is, and again, it doesn't happen in Nail because I didn't learn about it until a couple of years later. That's not our oldest text anymore, and so to find out more about that,
the oldest?
It's called the Egerton Gospel, and it's a miracle that Jesus is doing in the River Jordan. That comes from one of those other Gospels we don't talk about because they didn't make the cut, of which there were many.
It's so funny how this whole process is so human. Like, it's just a bunch of councils deciding things and throwing books out and putting them in, and for completely like political reasons, mostly, and
and what's funny about that is you don't even need a conspiracy. So many of these changes were just because this one monk said, "Oh, that's a mistake. We all know that blah 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 is the case." So he just fixed it. No one told him to do it. There wasn't some Illuminati saying we'll have this written. They were all working on their own. And we still have some manuscripts, and I've got these in my book, Jesus Mything in Action, where you can see the line notes from the scribe saying, "Hey, change this word to this word, or change these letters to this letter to make it a different word." Or, "Hey, leave that writing alone, you knave. Don't fix that. Put it back the way it was."
Right.
And again,
regarding the manuscripts, regarding the manuscripts, you were talking about Lee Strobel. Man, that was an awful movie, right? The case.
I think I'm gonna have to do a whole book on Lee Strobel because what a jackass he is.
I'll
His whole
definitely read that. Yeah.
shtick is so tired and lame, and everything he says is a lie.
I think I saw an article that you wrote with somebody talking about how he wasn't necessarily even an atheist.
Exactly.
He was like yeah.
Yeah. I mean, his story was weird when he was saying, "Yeah, I was an atheist, so I prayed to God to see if he was real." It's like, what? Who does that? Nobody does that. Yeah. And the whole time he was going to church with his wife and he was raised Lutheran or something. I don't remember. But I mean, the dude had a brief period where he was a lapsed Christian, and he tries to spin it that he was a tough skeptic and he didn't believe in this. And it wasn't until he went off on this thing and interviewed all these guys. It's like he interviewed those guys after he'd been a pastor for like 20 years, and it was his third book. It's like, dude, you are full of lies. Lies.
In the movie, all he does is go around like interviewing people, and he just like believes everything they say.
Exactly.
Like,
exactly.
Who would even do that? Like, not question it, not investigate.
No, Landon. He was a tough skeptic. He was tough.
Oh yeah.
Your mother says she loves you. Check it out. Yeah, he checked it out.
Tide goes in, tide goes out. Can't explain that,
Exactly. What killed me is I had an interview with one of his experts, because the guy said, "Well, in the book you say this, and I know you don't believe that. So can you clarify that?" And he said, "Yeah, I think Lee Strobel took some liberties with what I said," and he said something. It's like, that's why they all sound exactly alike, is because this is Lee Strobel talking to us.
That's not surprising at all.
Yeah.
But on the manuscripts, you say Strobel crows that there is a mountain of Christian manuscripts compared to the anthills of Tacitus and Josephus.
Yeah.
As Metzger notes that fewer than 650 Greek manuscripts of Homer's Iliad survive. And you say that there's more than a little irony in hearing Christians bragging about the number of their scriptures that survived from antiquity, seeing that it was the early Christians who controlled what was preserved and what was lost. And much of the ancient world's classic literature was discarded or even put to the torch by the Christian West. As it was, nearly all the works of the Greek philosophers were lost to Dark Age Europe until the Crusades.
Yeah.
So,
and do you know who helped preserve those evil Muslims? It's like, come on, man.
Yeah. Irony upon irony upon irony. Yeah.
It's insane.
It is.
What do you think about sorry, I was gonna say, what do you think about
all right, let me finish and you can go.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you say we have no reason to suspect that the scribes altered writings from Homer or Caesar to support their particular religious dogma, but we have every reason to suspect it was the New Testament. Suspect it with the New Testament. In fact, we know that they did. Exactly. There is overwhelming evidence of the practice running rampant for centuries.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Go ahead, Scott.
I was going to ask, what do you think about where in 4 different places in the New Testament it alleges that Jesus still supports the Old Testament, and what do you think about that? And with all the contradictions and how this runs rampantly wild, why does this not give more people, not even necessarily the Christians that we would like to change their mind, but the atheists you've spoken of who think he's a real figure?
Yeah.
I mean, what did they think he was teaching from? And did he see these contradictions? Did he get them from oral traditions passed down? Did he have something to read from? What was he preaching from? That's what I would like to know. Like, is there anything you've read or learned that kind of narrows that down more?
Well, for instance, I mean, I can't speak to Jesus because I don't think the dude existed. Paul probably existed. I would be very surprised if he didn't exist, even though so much of what we know about him is bullshit. Everything we love about Paul is pretty much bullshit. For instance, the book of Hebrews, which is a weird-ass book that doesn't seem to have a lot to do with the rest of the New Testament, probably is what people like Paul and his generation were preaching before the Gospels were written. It's this cosmic Christ who he's their high priest, but he's in the sanctuary of heaven. He's doing all this off camera up in heaven. And that's where he gets compared to Melchizedek, who is like, had no father, no mother, no genealogy. And it's like, and says things like, now, if he had been on earth, or if he were on earth, then he starts comparing him to the priests on earth. It's very weird if you try to connect it to our Jesus. Makes perfect sense if we're talking about a mystery faith that's been turned into a Jewish version of the mystery faiths.
Right. Yeah. Getting into Paul specifically, into the details of it, you say that Paul never talks about Jesus' death as though it actually happened to a real man from Galilee who lived on earth a few years before.
Yeah.
Nor does he give any details about the events of Jesus' life, not the places he traveled, not the miracles he performed, not the parables he told, not even the teachings or instructions he gave. Even a few vague references to people we think of as Jesus' friends and family are problematic.
Yep.
For instance, we hear nothing about Jesus' virgin birth, nothing about Mary or Joseph, Bethlehem or Nazareth, Herod or Caesar, shepherds or wise men, a manger or a star over Bethlehem. So,
and again, I go into much more detail about all of these in the book Jesus Mything in Action.
I'm going to check that out. Absolutely. You talk about getting into the mystery cults. Christianity was not the only religion or the first to have a Lord's Supper. Paul uses a term from the pagan mystery cults, Kurikon Diepnon, the Lord's Supper.
Right.
These mystery faiths were ancient sects found throughout the Mediterranean world. Each had its own savior god or goddesses who promised resurrection, and many, if not most, of these mysteries included communal sacred meals, often involving bread and wine.
And baptism too. And we still have
Right.
those invitations of come join me at the supper of Our Lady Isis or fill in the blank. You know, we still have some of those
Right.
invitations.
Yeah. You talk about Paul only had to quote Jesus' own teachings, and that would have settled many of the issues that he
Right.
talked about. Case closed.
Right.
So why doesn't Paul ever ask what would Jesus do?
Yep.
It's
And
like
same with
letters
the
to
Book of
communities
Acts.
and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, the Book of Acts has Peter have this whole vision. It's like, well, Jesus already said this, you know, in chapter 1. Why are we having this, revisiting this whole thing?
This is specifically what my master said. You know, he lived. We have his words. He
Right.
never says that.
Right. And another funny thing is Paul's constantly reminding his churches what Paul taught them. How come he never has to remind them what Jesus taught them?
Kind of like how Moses
on certain things.
It's kind of like how Moses spoke for God. I mean, how do we really know this is what God wanted? And why would he destroy the tablets? And why kill everyone and keep only the young women for yourself? I mean, it says virgin, but I think that word in original Aramaic just means young woman. So that means they had even more spoils of war, as it's called. You know,
well, because he said if any woman has slept with a man, kill her. I don't know how they figured that out, but still, that's what we're talking about here. Yeah.
Tell me about the Philippians 2:8, the like earliest like hymn that had to have a resurrection inserted into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Called the Kenosis hymn. There was a. I think there's a little more to unpack in that, and my view has kind of changed on that because there was a theologian Couchot, a historian, a French historian Couchot, who said in this hymn, Jesus doesn't get the name Jesus until after his resurrection. You know, before then he was named something else like Joshua or some other equally apt name, since so many characters in the Gospels have very apt names, places too. And a Christian pointed out that no, they're not talking about his name. They're talking about the name above all names. So that's how he became God. And so it's a little murkier than it's not so cut and dry to me.
Was he called Lord kind of like a title, or did his name mean that? Or there's some confusion there with some people, right? What do you think about that?
That reminds me, when you were talking earlier about Nazareth, and I talk about this in Jesus Mything in Action, Mark, our earliest gospel, never actually calls him Jesus of Nazareth.
It's exactly.
Jesus the Nazarene or the Nazarite. It's a sect title. And that confusion about Bethlehem versus Cana versus Nazareth, as you point out, all those had biblical prophetic ties to it. So it's no wonder he seems to have 3 different places that he started from, depending on which Christian you asked. And again, all our biographies about Jesus come to us after centuries, if not millennia, of people shaving off the serial numbers of where they really got this information and harmonizing it. And yet, even after that process, when you read something like John and the other Gospels, he's not even trying to make his Jesus match up. The timing is completely off. And we're lucky. We're lucky we still have the Gospel of Mark at all, because that was the one that Matthew and Luke both used as their base. They weren't trying to start a new gospel. Each of them was trying to write the one true gospel. All the ones who wrote gospels were trying to write the one gospel. And,
Right.
It was centuries before somebody thought, you know what, let's just put them all together. And John almost didn't make the cut because it's so unlike the other ones that, they think it may have been a Gnostic who wrote it. And now it's the most un-Gnostic gospel because
that's another thing
to de-Gnostify.
I found interesting is there were like sects of Christians who thought there were like more than one God. Like the Marcionites, they believed like the God of the Old Testament was like a different God, and so.
And again, we have no writings from that whole period. The early writings, the early stages, when we'd most want to have to know what the early Christians were saying, there's no way to know it. It's been lost. The Nag Hammadi Gospels. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Nag Hammadi library. Yeah. That's this. For your listeners, that was this library that was buried in the 3rd century, 4th century, hundreds of years after the fact, by these monks who didn't want it to be rubbed out of Christian history. And when we found it, we would have no idea how wiggy and bizarre Christianity was as late as the 3rd century or the 4th century.
Like the Carpocratians, the group that kind of ritually swapped spouses, and
There's so many, and all the things about those we're hearing from the heretic hunters. So we're hearing from like the Lee Strobels of their day saying, look how bad these guys are. So it's hard to take, we have to take with a grain of salt what they were saying about different heresies. For instance, the heresies who believe that God only showed up in spirit. Price has suggested, and other scholars have suggested, well, that's not really what it was. They were saying that Jesus didn't come at all. He was only a spirit,
Right. I think Celsus is a really interesting figure.
Yeah.
He's kind of a Christian critic that lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era, something like that.
Yeah.
There's something else I wanted to get into called the triadic cycles in the Gospels. I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I got a couple of slides here. Yeah. All right. Let me know if you can.
Oh, you're back. You're back. Oh,
can you see my screen?
No, I lost you. I'm losing you. Oh, wait, there he is. There's the screen. Here's the screen.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So, for example, they have like this structure, and this is not how reality happens. Things don't match up with this kind of symmetry in real life. So this is from I'm not sure which gospel this is, but you can see how like things kind of like echo each other. So it's like you get A, B, C, D, and then you get to the middle and it starts over. It's like D, C, B, A. Can you see that pretty clearly?
Yeah, I can see it, and I know what you're talking about. And I actually do talk about this in Jesus Mything in Action. I break it down how you see this in the Old Testament a lot. It's called a chiastic structure. It's the stories are made this, like that Genesis song Abacab. It's like this happens and this happens, and I'm not doing a very good job of explaining it, but it's where the structure echoes itself.
Right.
This is a lot like how a lot of old oral traditions were, right?
Yes.
Where it kind of had the same kind of symmetry, Yeah.
And again, the Old Testament has a lot of it too, where the stories themselves, what's happening in the story, the beginning echoes the ending, and it comes together at the middle.
It's not just the echoing of the ending and the beginning, though. It's like every part of it, like
every point in the story. Exactly.
Kind of like a poetic structure of how you would set up your rhymes for later. Yeah.
Very like, I think there's a lot of things that we don't get because we don't speak Hebrew or Greek, where there's either a pun or there's a rhyme or there's a name that's super apt, that's so apt, it's like, okay, you're being ridiculous now. It's clearly an allegorical figure.
The Good Samaritan,
yeah.
On the way to Samaria.
Just using this example, I'm not sure how well you can see this because it's actually smaller than I thought it would be, but so you get like this is from one of the Gospels. I can't see which one. I think it's Matthew. This is from one of Carrier's books. So you get A, Passover and crucifixion, and when we start over to the ending, like A, that's echoed at the very end, you get Passover and resurrection. B at the top, priest plot. B at the bottom, priest plot.
Yeah.
C, ABC is Jesus anointed for burial, and then the C from the end is Jesus buried.
Yeah.
And you get just again all this symmetry and all these things matching up that obviously were very, premeditated, put together. They're not how life happens.
That council committee type setup, yeah.
Yeah, and we see this repeatedly over and over in the Gospels. Yeah, another thing that is not how real life works, but especially in Mark's Gospel, he has a thing for threes, for triplets, and there's like 3 people crucified and 3 women are watching, and he's there for 3 hours between each of the station, the moments of the Passion. It's broken into these 3-hour increments. There's just threes all over the place.
So it's very fascinating.
Yeah.
Go ahead and stop sharing.
And we don't know that much. Most Christians don't know that much about what's called gematria, the sacred geometry of the Jews.
Right.
So a lot of these things, like there's a great parable where he feeds the loaves and fishes, and at the end he says, "Well, how many loaves and fishes were there? 7, 12," and he's like, "Get it," and it's like your average Christian would just go, have no idea what he's talking about, but. It's these winks to the reader that he wants the educated people to know. See, I'm talking about this. I'm talking about that. It's a good story for the plebes, but you and I know we're this.
Right. Well, David, what in the Bible is original? What idea in the Bible is original? Because I'm struggling to find any, and I guess we'll kind of close on that question.
That's a great. I too am struggling because it seems like no matter how fresh and original Jesus is saying something, we can find, so and so said this before. It's ironic that they say, he doesn't teach like the Pharisees. He teaches this bold. It's like so many of his things were stolen from the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, the real Pharisees in the real world, would have loved somebody like Jesus. They hated the Sadducees, the fat cats who were the Roman toadies that were running the temple. They would have loved Jesus. Oh, they would have loved him so much, yeah.
One thing I've heard is
70 years later, they were the main rivals to the Christians, and suddenly, boom, they're the bad guys.
Right. Yeah, one thing I've heard, I think, from Airmen is like, the Jews expected like the Messiah to be like a warrior king, but there were so many sects of Judaism around that time that.
Bingo. Yeah. Exactly. 18 at least that we know of, Right. Yeah. It was more diverse than it was.
Then at different times he used kind of that analogy of, bring those before me who wouldn't worship me and slay them. And that's like him telling a story some king told. And then at other times it's turned the cheek. So, I mean, like, which one is it? I mean, this guy can't even make sense of what he's saying himself.
Yep. It's like Jesus says a lot of things,
Speaking of saying things, one last thing I would love to have your thoughts on. What do you think about the passages where someone somehow was able to write down what Jesus was saying to himself when he's alone by himself? There's some quick thoughts of yours on that.
Well, it's just precious and adorable. Like, not just Jesus, but Matthew knows what dreams that Joseph had, and he knows the exact moment when Satan entered Judas's heart. It's like, wow, it's very observant of you for a guy who wasn't even there by your own admission. Yeah. It's when, and also he knows the secret meetings that went, the plotting behind the scenes. He knows what was being said in that interview with Pontius Pilate. In that incredibly unhistorical account of his trial and execution.
Right. Yeah. When we look at the ethics
the places we go when we study biblical history, the rabbit holes just go and keep coming.
When we look at the ethics, of the Bible of Jesus, not original. I believe there was a Jewish rabbi, Hillel, right? Rabbi Hillel, who said kind of the same things. Yeah. And if we go back to like a lot of ancient Greek authors, said much the same thing.
Cynics, Stoics, Pharisees, we found all those guys echoed in what Jesus was saying and teaching.
Yeah, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think, had some of that too.
And I love how Christians, they never fail to say, Jesus was so radically different from everything around him. And the Old Testament, the love God showed to his people, is so radically different from. It's like, dude, it's the same exact stuff.
And also the mythology. Obviously, immaculate conception, virgin birth, dying and rising, sacraments, eating the body of the God, baptism, all of that. Yeah, definitely.
And even our own four gospels don't agree on all that stuff happening too. It's
right. Well, actually, one last thing. What do you say to people that say the gospels are like there's like a car wreck and there's going to be 4 different witnesses? Of course, they're going to get details wrong.
Oh, God.
They do. Yeah. But here's the thing. For instance, let's just take John and the Synoptics. The last week or so of Jesus' life, all 4 gospels are very detailed, like this happened, and this happened, this happened. But they don't match up. If you take John's week of Jesus and
they're copying verbatim. They're just copying the same source.
They are, and when they're not copying, they're going off in completely incompatible directions.
And they have agendas. They have obvious.
They have agendas. They're
divergent agendas,
and for different reasons. And all the supporting characters are changed. For instance, John, his Jesus is crucified because he rose Lazarus from the dead. That the whole thing is structured around that happening, and then everybody loses their shit, and he has to be killed. In the other Gospels, Lazarus doesn't exist at all, except as the name of one of Luke's parables. That's as close as it get. Unrelated character altogether, and things that happen at the beginning of his ministry in John happen at the end of his ministry in the other Gospel. It's crazy. It's crazy trying to make sense of it all.
Yeah, and we could go on all day just kind of digging into all this.
Exactly, but it's certainly not a case of, well, Matthew says he was wearing a blue T-shirt and Luke says it was a red T-shirt. No, this is not. Yeah, that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Mr. Fitzgerald, David, thank you so much.
Mr. Haynes, Mr. Gaines, thank you.
Thank you. This is fun.
If I can just leave on one note, if you liked Nailed, you'll love Jesus Mything in Action even more. And you might even like my book, The Mormons, too. It's a lot of fun, too.
Yeah, I want to read that one. I love the Mormons. They are just batshit crazy. It's insane.
They are. So I'm working
definitely the one you mentioned, the sex and violence, I think.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's it.
And I'm also working on one on the Jehovah's Witnesses, speaking of batshit crazy. So
excellent.
Stay tuned for all those.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks again, guys. Take care.